Hey, it's Pastor Dave Schreffler from Trinity Lutheran Church, Lemoyne. It's time for another Gander at the Gospel. Time to take a look at what the Gospel is saying to us this week. This is, this Sunday coming up is August 9th, 2020. We have a lesson from the Gospel of St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." This is the gospel of the Lord. As part of our Gander at the Gospel, this is for August 9th, 2020. We also have a reading from 1 Kings 19, verses 9 to 18. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." The Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." So tell me, do you do this? Do you sleep with a fan on in your bedroom, or maybe you sleep with headphones in your ears, listening to something that helps you get to sleep? You know, I have for years slept with a fan on in our bedroom because it helps block out the noises from outside and even inside the house, right? I find that when it's too quiet, it's really hard to get to sleep. A lot of people can't take a lot of silence in their lives. Have you heard about these things called deprivation tanks? Of course, there's this room in, I forget where it is, Illinois or someplace out in the Midwest, Ohio maybe. That's the quietest room in the world, right? People can only stay in those rooms for a short period of time because it's so quiet. But they have these saltwater deprivation tanks that you can lie in. I was listening to a podcast the other day. A guy was talking about this saltwater deprivation tank that he had gone in. You're supposed to get some kind of Zen experience from this. He said, let's see, he said, when you get in the tank, if you have any kind of a cut anywhere on your body, you're going to know about it because of that salt, right? The salt gets in those open cuts that you might have. And of course, you can't touch your eyes, can't touch your ears because there's so much salt in the water. You're supposed to float on the water, but it does get in your ears and stuff. And he said finally, it was so distracting to be in this tank, it didn't do anything to get him into some kind of a Zen mood. So, a lot of people just can't stand silence in their lives. And I wonder sometimes, why is it so unnerving to us? I used to know this guy, still friends with him. He's worked in a business where he worked with a lot of younger people and on construction sites. And he used to lament to me about how the people that he worked with would play music so loud in the workplace. They were just blaring this music. And he used to talk about how he thought that his coworkers didn't want to listen to their own thoughts in their heads, and so they played music so that it would just kind of drown out all of that. I've got one of those brains that is constantly thinking, constantly worrying, constantly, and it is good sometimes to break out to try to block out some of those thoughts. But if you think about it, silence can be deafening. It can be outright scary, especially, like I said, for people like myself who just can't seem to like too much silence. And you have to wonder, what is it about silence that becomes so distracting? Is it the expectation that you don't know when that silence is going to end, or that worry that you have that you don't know what's going to break the silence? I was reading a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. The poem is called Silence, a Fable. He wrote it's a bit of a short story, I guess. He wrote it in 1838, was when it was first published. And just a brief synopsis, right? He sets up this poem in this really place full of desolation. It happens somewhere along a river in Zaire, maybe in the jungle. There are three characters in this short story. One is the narrator who narrates the story, but there's also a demon in the story. And he first lays out the desolation in the place, that there is a lot of scrub brush and lilies around, but and it's raining and it's getting dark, and after the rain falls, it turns to blood, and the lilies that are there and the scrubs are shrieking and yelling, and it's, like I said, it's a place of desolation. And the demon sees that there's a gray rock in the middle of this place that he calls desolation, and upon this gray rock appears a man dressed in a toga that is of the Roman period, he says. But the man in the toga has the face of a deity, and the man sits down upon this large gray rock. And of course, the demon wants to, I don't know, for some reason, scare this man away. So the demon calls a hippopotami to come and to sit at the bottom of the rock and roar, right? And the man on the rock just sits there with his head in his hand. And then the demon calls lightning to flash and to strike down around the man, and thunder, and this rain that turns to blood, and the lilies are shrieking, and wind that destroys the forest. And the man just sits there on the gray rock with his head on his hand, not moving. And then finally, the demon calls upon silence, and everything stops. The lightning stops, the thunder stops, the screaming stops, all the noise stops, and the man gets up from the rock and runs away. Desolation doesn't scare the man. Silence sends him running. And it makes me think we've been living with a lot of chaos in our lives lately with this pandemic. We see the chaos in our world. We see it in our country. We see it, within our community. We see it online. People yelling and just, being vicious with one another. And it's happening so much that it's almost that we're becoming numb to the chaos around us. What happens to us when the silence comes in our lives? So I've read this reading from 1 Kings chapter 19, and we hear about Elisha, who has recently seen the glory of the Lord in his life through when he defeated the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel in a spectacular format where fire comes down from the sky and consumes this altar, and then all of the priests of Baal are rounded up, and Elijah has them killed. And then Jezebel, who's married to Ahab, King Ahab, is so angered at what Elisha has done. Jezebel says, "Elijah, you are next." So Elisha escapes, and he goes to a mountain, and he climbs into a cave, and he's by himself in that cave, and he pleads with God to end his life. But God has something to show Elijah. And so God sends a wind. He sends a great wind that breaks rocks, but God is not in the wind. And then he sends an earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. And then he sends a fire, but God is not in the fire. And then God sends silence. What is in the silence? Or what is God saying? What is God saying in that silence or through that silence? Elijah has seen such great success, and God has shown such power in defeating the priests of Baal. And yet, when Elijah takes his eyes off of God because of his fear of Jezebel, Elijah loses his nerve. But God has another thought, another idea for Elijah. And then we have Peter and the disciples who, after feeding the 5,000, are sent out on a boat while Jesus goes up the mountain to pray and dismisses the crowd. And then they're in the boat at night, and a storm comes up, and they're without Jesus, and they're fighting this storm, and Jesus comes walking on the water, and the disciples first think it's a ghost, but then when they see that it's Jesus, Peter says, "Lord, bid me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come on and come." And Peter starts to walk, but when he takes his eyes off of Jesus, he begins to sink. Jesus catches him, and as soon as they get into the boat, there is silence, a dead calm. What is in the silence in these two stories? What is God saying to us today about silence? It's interesting. In the great noise, the great commotion on Mount Carmel, the great fire, that didn't turn Jezebel away from her evil ways, and it didn't increase her fear in God. The wind, the earthquake, the fire that God gives to Elijah realizes, or God says, God was not in those terrible things. The storm on the Sea of Galilee that frightens the disciples did not contain Jesus. But in the midst of the chaos, God came in the silence to Elijah. And in the midst of the storm, Jesus comes to the disciples, especially Peter, and he stills the storm. And in that silence, when the storm is stilled, all of those in the boat, all of the disciples say, "Surely, truly, you are the Son of God." God does not need earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes or floods or fires or any of those things, any chaotic, miraculous signs to show God's presence in the world and in our lives. God comes through that still, small voice, in the silence of our hearts and our minds and our heads and our lives. In the midst of chaos, Jesus comes to say, "I am. Do not doubt. Do not be afraid." In the current circumstances of this pandemic chaos that we are living in, we are always bombarded with a cacophony of voices that try to make us think this and that, try to make us go this way and that way. We have a cacophony of voices. They want to give advice, that offer conflicting messages, that want us to follow their own branding of this pandemic. Soon we become so numb to all of it that we just say, enough. I'm done, right? After the conflicting voices make us numb in the midst of the desolation, this chaos then wants to try to sink us, like it threatened to sink Peter. That poem that I read, or that short story I read by Edgar Allan Poe, Silence, a Fable. The demon eventually was the cause of the silence, and the man fled. But the demon has a great laugh at his expense, and yet the narrator, towards the end of that story, does not laugh with the demon, I believe, because the narrator knows that desolation is not what brings comfort. There are a lot of small g gods, a lot of small g gods, a lot of gods that, or entities that try to bind us in their false acts of power, their false stories. There are ways to bind us in their desolation. But God does not need such demonstrations. God comes in the greatest, most powerful expression of his presence, often that is silence. On a cold night in Bethlehem, in the midst of a silent night, we hear a baby's cry break through that silence. After his baptism in the Jordan, a dove descends in the silence, and a voice breaks through that silence saying, "This is my son." And when the stone is found removed from the tomb, the only thing that fills that tomb is emptiness and silence. And from that silence, a still small voice says, "Peace be with you. Do not doubt, just believe." It's in the silence often that God brings the most comfort to us. That still small voice that says, "You are my child. You are loved." So I hope this brings you some hope this week in this ever increasing difficult time that we are in. Thank you for listening to my Gander at the Gospel. Remember, it's not what theologian you follow, it's not what church you attend that defines your faith. What defines your faith is that living active participation in a relationship with Jesus Christ that drives us every day to do deeds of love, deeds of service, living out the great command to love God with our whole heart, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Go out there and be someone's thankful today. God bless you.